Don't be shy. We miss everybody. We miss doing this in person, and we're excited to have you all here. I just fill the air for the first couple of minutes until we start our official introductions, just so people don't come into an empty, a silent room. Nobody likes coming into a quiet room. And I'll get started officially in just a couple of minutes, and this is your time to just get used to Zoom. I hope most of you saw the film already. If not, you have until Friday at midnight, I've been told, October 9th, to see it on our platform, and we'll hear more in a moment of how else you can access this film and share it with your friends, because that, of course, is crucial. Help spread the word about this wonderful film. We'll just give people another minute till they join. Thank you all for taking the time tonight. I see our friend Marge Goldwater's here. Hi, Marge. I'll start sharing as well that if you would like to ask questions, after I'll start off with a few questions, but if you would like to ask some questions, you of course can put them in the chat box, and then we'll call on you and we could unmute your mic so you could ask these questions live and direct them to our panel for tonight. I think we could get started and jump into things officially. This is when I'll recommend that you now switch to speaker view on the top right of your screen, from gallery to speaker, so you can actually focus on the speakers and have the speakers large on your screens. Good evening, everyone. My name is Isaac Zablocki. I am the Director of Film Programs here at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. Thank you for joining us tonight for this very special Q&A for the film Mighty Ira, and we'll get into that more in a moment. First, I will tell you some upcoming films that we have here at the JCC. This week, we're going to be screening the film Oliver Sacks, His Own Life. If you haven't seen that one yet, we presented it originally at our ReelAbilities Film Festival, the New York Disabilities Film Festival. It's a fabulous film, and we are proud to be able to present it again. We had a great Q&A with the director of the film and one of the participants in the film. The director, of course, is the legendary Rick Burns, so we are happy to share all of that and for you to be a part of this wonderful film. So please join us for that. Also coming up next week, we're launching our fall film course on new Israeli cinema that I'm going to be leading. So please join us for that and register in advance. We're also having this October the film Somewhere to Be, which is about a senior home downtown in the good old days when we could all get together in places like that. And we'll be closing off the month with the film Rosenwalds. We're also about to lock our November films, and in December we have our Other Israel Film Festival about minority populations in Israel. So much to come. Please be sure to check our weekly emails. But now over to Mighty Ira. In case you can't see the poster in his background, please welcome one of the directors of the film, Nico Perrino. Nico, thank you so much for being here.
Isaac, thanks for having me.
And we are extremely honored to have here Mighty Ira himself, Ira Glasser. Ira, thank you so much for being here.
I flew in on my cape.
and I love the lighting, the dark in the back, very dramatic. I'll start off with a few questions, and then folks, please be a part of this conversation and join us and tell us, ask your questions too. If you have questions, please place them in the chat, and we will call you out and let you know that you can ask your question live, and we will unmute you. So diving into the film, this was a fascinating film. I have to admit, I did not grow up in that generation. I know of Skokie from the movies, actually, only. What's his name? Danny
Kaye.
Danny Kaye, thank you. That Danny Kaye movie that my parents forced me to watch, and I think my school, my elementary school, forced me to watch. But that's how I knew the Skokie story. And this plays a huge role in this film. And actually, Nico, I'm going to start with you. That's one of the anchors of the film, is the Skokie story, of course. Why did you choose that story?
Well, it wasn't actually originally going to be the through line for the film. So anyone who's seen the film knows that we spent a lot of time going to different portions of Ira's life, but kind of the Skokie story we come back to repeatedly. It originally was just going to be one kind of 13-minute segment until we started doing a little bit more research on it, and we started interviewing Ira and then his colleague David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney in Illinois, and Philippa Strum, who wrote kind of the definitive book about it called When the Nazis Came to Skokie. It just ended up being such a compelling story and weaved all the threads that we wanted to weave on the First Amendment issues we wanted to talk about. And of course, then it brings you through to 2017 in Charlottesville, and the parallels there are uncanny. So it was just kind of a natural, we knew it was always going to be a part, but it ended up becoming kind of the central theme as we weaved in and out of the rest of Ira's story, including his growing up in Brooklyn, seeing Jackie Robinson break the color barrier, his friendship with William F. Buckley, and so on.
And Ira, did you feel the same way? Did you feel that Skokie really played, kind of like encapsulates a lot of your work and what this film was trying to tell?
Well, in some ways it was an outlier. It was not the normal case, but it's the case that probably illustrates how the First Amendment needs to work better than any other case that I ever remember. And of course, we also had this unexpected thing where we ran into Ben Stern, and and that was just sort of an independent accident. What happened there was that a friend of mine, who was a friend of Ben Stern's daughter, called me and told me about Stern and that his daughter was making a documentary about him and his amazing life. And would I take a look at a draft video of it? And I didn't know why they wanted me to do that, but it was a friend asked, so I watched it. And of course, at the very end of this documentary about Ben Stern, it turns out he moves into Skokie with his wife and his children, and he becomes part of the community that is trying to resist the neo-Nazis from coming. And that's why they wanted me to watch it. And it ended up that I had a warm and wonderful relationship with him, and actually went out to Berkeley, where he lives now. He just turned 99. Wow. And he and I participated in a panel discussion about the Skokie case, where they showed the documentary about his life. And so he became wound into this in a way that I don't think anybody on our end anticipated. And it's a wonderful story. And 50 years later, 45 years later, I end up having this remarkable relationship with this guy whose name I didn't know during the Skokie case. And he didn't know me either. He just, we were adversaries in an abstract way in court, but we didn't know each other. And now I think it's fair to say we're warm friends, and it's a remarkable thing, really.
If I would add, Ben Stern, for those who haven't seen the film, a Holocaust survivor, I believe he survived 9 concentration camps, 2 death marches, 2 ghettos. When we were going through the archival footage, well, we had gone out in 2017 to film the first ever meeting between Ira and Ben Stern. The name of that documentary is Near Normal Man. My colleague Chris Maltby, who's a co-director on this, went out there. So it's Mighty Ira meets Near Normal Man. But then we were going through the archival footage, and Ben Stern is one of the questioners on the Phil Donahue show back in 1978. And so we have this modern day footage, and then we're just happening to go through NBC's archival footage, and we see him there. And then we go through ABC's archival footage, and we see him there being interviewed by the ABC reporter too. So you see Ben Stern through this 45-year progression, and that was just a coincidence as well, but a welcome one.
Yes, he's a fascinating character that definitely made sure that he was going to represent there. Let's step back for a moment, and both of you can tell me your perspectives on how this started, why this started, and how this came together, how this wonderful grouping between filmmakers and Ira came together?
Well, I'll let Nico answer that since I don't know the answer. He just approached me, and so it started. The origin story is his.
Well, I'll try and remember the origin story, and you can correct me where you think I'm wrong. But the origin to me really began at Nat Hendoff's funeral at Riverside Memorial Chapel. This was January 2017. Those of you who know Nat know he was a longtime columnist for the Village Voice and a number of other publications, kind of the inventor of liner notes, or the perfecter of liner notes in jazz, I should say. I was there with a friend of mine, Michael Myers, who knows Ira Glasser. Michael's in the film as well. And Michael introduces me to Ira and Norman Siegel, who's also in our film. Norman was a longtime director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. So I go up and shake their hand, and it's either Norman or Ira, I forget who, said, "You do what we used to do." And I said, "Oh, and who are you and what did you used to do?" And then they introduced themselves, of course. I defend First Amendment rights professionally in the higher education context. So that was my first time meeting Ira, and I invited him on my podcast. I host a podcast, so to speak, the Free Speech Podcast. And Ira said, "I'm happy to come on, but I retired in 2001, and I don't know if I'll remember anything." So he comes to my apartment, and 3 hours later, he's still talking and remembers everything, as sharp as a knife. And he just had so much to say about the First Amendment that was informed by history that I believe my generation, I was 27 when I started this film, I'm 30 now, so much that my generation, I feel like, has forgotten, that a lot of the First Amendment rights that Ira and his generation fought to defend was learned about in the civil rights era, seeing what the Southern mayors and Southern governors would do to civil rights activists, and that sort of inspiring the positions they took in Skokie. And then, Ira told me about seeing Jackie Robinson break the color barrier and his friendship with William F. Buckley, which really spoke to me about talking across lines of political difference, something that's kind of hard to do these days. And so I just thought there was a very compelling story here, and we thought it was going to be a 30-minute doc short. It turned it into a 98-minute feature. I'm happy it did.
Ira, you concur? This is how it all happened?
Yes, I just did the interviews, and I didn't see any part of this until it was completed. So I watched it for the first time a couple of months ago when it was completed. And you never know when there's something like that made about you, whether you're going to like it or not. And you have to be prepared not to like it, or at least not to like some of it. And my concern was that it was going to be only about the First Amendment. The First Amendment was a huge issue for us at the ACLU, but it was one of a dozen issues, that all of which were important to me and all of which formed my passion for civil liberties. And the one that was the most of those was race, and I wanted the film to include that too. And through the story about Jackie Robinson, it did. And so, yeah, I was very happy with it. Nobody can ever make a film about me again, because it can't be as good.
You were mentioning earlier that in some ways, you've been retired now for 20 years.
19
years.
Yes.
But who's counting? And in some ways, you're coming out of retirement now for the first time into the public eye, and doing all these interviews and being a part of all these programs again. What I wanted to know was as someone who is so active, and I mean, I see, obviously, you see it in the film, how natural it is for you to voice your opinion. How were you able to stop when you retired?
Well, because I wanted to stop, because there were other things that drove me. I wanted to spend more time with my kids. I wanted to spend more time on the beach. I wanted to spend more time in the gym playing basketball and working out. I did all those things while I was working, but when you work 70, 80, 90-hour weeks for 30 years, it interferes with a lot. And some people get all of their fulfillment out of their jobs, and I got a lot of fulfillment out of mine, but not all. And one of the things that happens when you get to be in your early 60s, as I was when I retired, is that you don't get morbid, but you have a sense that time is not infinite any longer. You know, when you're 18 and 20 and 30 and 35, it seems like forever. And then you realize that, well, supposing I worked for 5 more years or 8 more years until I was 70 or 75, I certainly had enough energy, I had enough commitment, I wasn't getting tired of the job. But what would I accomplish in another 5 years above what I had already accomplished? And what would it steal from the rest of my life that I couldn't get back? You know, there are some things you can't postpone because they don't recur. You can't postpone watching your grandchildren grow up, or playing with them, or taking the 5-year-old to a ball game in the afternoon. That doesn't happen again. And if that passes, it's gone. And so I just decided that I wanted to stop. And I never regretted it. I mean, I didn't stop reading. I didn't stop screaming at people about things. I didn't stop writing entirely. I chaired the board of the Drug Policy Alliance for 20 years, which was a board role, not a staff role. So it didn't take up a huge amount of time, but it got me engaged in issues of race and issues of personal autonomy and privacy and illegal searches that had been part of my passion at the ACLU. So it wasn't like, you know, I went into the closet and hid, but I certainly lowered the temperature, and I paid attention to other aspects of my life that were important to me, and I've never regretted it.
And Nico, why do you find that now is the right time to tell this story, to tell Ira's story?
Well, as we've seen on college campuses, and of course with Charlottesville, there are a lot of high-profile free speech controversies where free speech seems to be in tension with the passionate pursuit for racial justice. And as Ira's story bears witness, and as the story of his colleagues who are also featured in the documentary bear witness, they're partners, they're not antagonists. Ira just wrote a beautiful op-ed in the Daily Beast on this subject. But I feel as though my generation is kind of ceding the politics of principle for the politics of expediency, and saying, you know, if we censor this group, then it's okay. But then, as Ira likes to say about poison gas, the way it's good when the enemy's in your sights, but then the wind has a tendency to shift. So I wanted to bring kind of the old school civil libertarian perspective on civil liberties back to my generation and remind them why this passionate defense of neutral principles that Ira and Norman and Nadine all pursued still has value. So that was the main reason. But also Ira's stories were just interesting. Like, who writes a letter to a sitting United States senator, not the least of which being Bobby Kennedy, and gets a meeting with him in Washington, D.C., and that's what charts your career? That just doesn't happen for 20-something-year-olds anymore. So, and seeing Jackie Robinson break the color barrier, and he grew up in a generation very different from the generation I grew up. Like punchball, stickball, I didn't know what any of that was until I talked with Ira about his days on the street in Brooklyn, where it didn't seem like parents existed. And even if you look at the footage, you don't see any parents there. So his story was interesting, but it also had an important lesson about the First Amendment and about talking across lines of difference with both Ben Stern and William F. Buckley, as we demonstrate in the film.
And I have to admit myself, also coming from a different generation, I saw this film in many ways as refreshing. Of course, you know, you want to. There was something. It was a more idealistic time. You feel like there was a in between, obviously, the childhood in Brooklyn that was this amazing, like you had this amazing freedom that can't be compared to the world that my children are growing up in right now, or you know, the civil rights movement and how you know things can really be changed in this country. And I mean, unfortunately, right now, I feel we're in an extreme moment, and hopefully it's just a moment of extreme. But but it's definitely, this film really captures a more innocent time. Ira, I wonder a little bit about your reflections on where we are now, what's happened in these last 20 years, or especially these probably last 4 years that
Well, you know,
things you
when
worked
I
on.
was when I was growing up in the 50s mostly, and throughout the 60s, I was nostalgic for the 1930s. I thought what you just said about the 60s, I used to say about the 30s. Oh, those were the days. Those were the days when people lived on principle, and when they organized labor unions, and they organized this and they organized that, and for me, they were just stories and history stories. But it sounded like it was very romantic and very idealistic in a way that in my time it wasn't. Now, you know, all these years later, you sit there and look back on my time and say about my time what I used to think about the 30s. The truth is that this is a very exciting time now. As depressing as it is, I mean, I grew up in the 50s during Joe McCarthy, during Richard Nixon's worst days, during Roy Cohn's worst days. Those were terrible times. Segregation ruled the land, and it didn't seem like it was ever going to stop. Women couldn't buy birth control, couldn't buy contraceptives, even if they were married. Abortion was illegal and a crime in every state. Being gay was a crime in every state. When you think about what the 50s were like, and you imagine, you know, Donald Trump wanted to go back to those wonderful days. What he wants to go back to is a time of great oppression, in which everybody who was relatively freer today than they were then was completely under the thumb of the criminal law and an oppressive government. And the 50s, you know, were called the silent generation. My generation didn't rabble rouse about it. We didn't protest much. Nobody went to demonstrations. That happened in the 60s, after I was out of school and the young people started to act up, in just the way that it's happening now. So, you know, I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that there are many white kids as Black kids in those demonstrations, marching every day against the tear gas, against the batons, against the police brutality, and in fear of COVID, is tremendously hopeful. I think there's more activity, more action, more resolve to make things better now than there's been in 40, 50 years. So as depressing as the political situation is, ask me the question again on November 4th and we'll see.
That's promising, and you know, even if there's an opposition, it's at least we have a strong voice and know that a lot of people are willing to stand up.
Well, there's always an opposition. I mean, you know, there's never a time when any freedom or any right has ever been won that wasn't won over a brutal opposition. You know, John Lewis, who just died, had his head fractured because he rode in a bus with white people through the South. People were shot, people were killed, people were beaten bloody. So, you know, you can't romanticize the progress too much. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't peaceful. The civil rights marches were nonviolent, but the people who attacked them were not nonviolent. And that's always the case with these struggles. So it's really not any, in many ways, I have been feeling upbeat, not because of who is in power. The bad guys always seem to be in power. But I've been feeling upbeat because of the energy from below. And it's always the energy from below that changes things. You know, in the March on Washington in 1963, which was the first big demonstration I ever went to, I was 25 years old. There was nobody from the Kennedy administration there to speak. There was not a single member of Congress there to speak. The entire march was a march from below. And a year later, the Civil Rights Act was passed. And 2 years later, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And now we're struggling to keep the Voting Rights Act from being unraveled by a conservative Supreme Court. But, you know, the Supreme Court has always been conservative. There were maybe 20 years between 1954 and 1973 where civil liberties dominated in the Supreme Court. But for all of its history, the Supreme Court has not been much of a friend of civil liberties. The friend of civil liberties have been the people who demanded their rights, who fought for their rights, who persisted until their rights were realized. And that's what's happening now. So, you know, I think it's in the darkest times that the struggle arises, and the struggle has arisen now. And that's a very hopeful sign to me.
It's making me hopeful too. And this is a good moment for us to thank our partners from the Center for Social Responsibility here at the Marlene Meyerson JCC, and know that they are extremely active, especially always, but especially at these times. And there's a lot of exciting things coming up, programs with them, dealing with the election, dealing with racial justice. And we'll be sharing with them, of course, our Cinematters Film Festival on MLK weekend. So mark your calendars for that. It's not yet public, but we'll share it with you here first. Let me jump into another question of where we are today. And I'd like to bring up, and this goes to both of you, but I'm going to start with Nico as giving the young perspective of freedom of speech, but Facebook. Where do you put Facebook in all of this these days?
Well, it's funny you say that, because Facebook is being quite difficult these days. We're trying to promote the film and its upcoming virtual cinema release with Angelica on Friday on Facebook. But our issue is our film is tagged a political film, and because it deals with social issues, and anything that deals with social issues has to go through the gauntlet with Facebook because of all the election meddling a couple of years ago. So we're actually having a hard time getting our ads through with Facebook in order to get this film in front of people. And that's an ongoing struggle. I remember back in 2011, around the time of the Arab Spring, when everyone thought these social media companies were the great democratizer. It was creating it was help foment and organizing all these protests in the Middle East. But boy, does the pendulum swing. Now I don't think they have friends anywhere. They don't have friends on the free speech side. They don't have friends who are looking to, to curtail Section 230, which kind of insulates them from civil liability. And very few friends in Congress. Joe Biden and President Donald Trump both are not fans of the social media companies. So and myself, as I said, I have some gripes with them as well. But social media wasn't around when Ira was at the ACLU, so it wasn't part of our film. Ira, I don't even think, did you tell me you didn't have a computer when you retired?
I was the only person at the ACLU who never had a computer. On the day I retired, after I retired, when I no longer had a secretary, I then bought a computer and learned how to use it. When I didn't have a computer, I didn't have a cell phone. And I wrote with a pen on yellow pads or white pads, and they never crashed.
But you were there, Ira. You were there in the battles in the late 90s over internet freedom and allowing some of these online platforms the freedom in order to grow and to publish user-generated content. Yeah,
well, that case challenging the so-called Child Protection Act was our case. And I didn't say nobody else had computers at the ACLU. I said I didn't have one. It was every time I tried to learn it, it seemed more complicated than it was worth. And finally, I was so close to retiring, I said, I'll just stick it out and retire without ever having used one. But unfortunately, as soon as I left, I got one, and I've been chained to it ever since.
And do you find, would you say that that social media, I don't know why I point out Facebook completely, because it's just one of the areas where there's been a lot of controversy as far as shows possibly the problems with freedom of speech. I'll say there, although I'm sure that's not something that could exist in your mind.
Well, it's not so much the problems with freedom of speech, it's the problems with a new kind of platform that nobody understands. When the printing press was invented in the 15th century, nobody had ever seen anything like that before, in the same way that nobody ever saw anything like computers before or social media. And people took a long time to get used to it. And the government in England and in other places in Europe did the same thing reflexively as the government here tried to do with the internet. They censored it. They made licensing laws. You couldn't print anything unless the government first said it was okay. And this kind of censorship went on for hundreds of years. Until it sort of worked itself out, until people could figure out. Now, speech didn't change, but what changed with the printing press is the ability of anybody who owned a printing press to say anything they want and distribute it to as many people as they could. Before that, the only people who wrote anything down were monks, and they distributed it to 7 people. So it wasn't a threat to the church, and it wasn't a threat to the government. But the printing press created an unregulated, anybody can say anything. Oh my God. And so the powers that be tried to stop it. And it took 500 years before that worked itself out. And at the time that the United States started in the 18th century, it was still not worked out. And there was, the First Amendment was not part of the original Constitution. That's why it's an amendment. When they first put the Constitution together that created this country, they didn't have a Bill of Rights. That was added later because they couldn't get the thing ratified unless they added a Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment was very controversial, and nobody paid attention to it. I mean, the First Amendment was passed in 1791, and a few years later, John Adams passed a Sedition Act and arrested people for criticizing him, including members of Congress and editors of newspapers. That's still in the early part of the 19th century, and so these things take centuries to work themselves out. The internet is brand new. Social media is brand new. Facebook is brand new. I mean, Facebook doesn't know what it is. It doesn't. It goes back and forth between I'm an electronic platform that anybody can mount like a soapbox in Central Park and say what they want. And then they decide, oh no, I'm a publisher, like the Times and the Washington Post, and I can publish anything I want. And you can't. So if you're just a platform, if you're just a soapbox, and anybody can mount it, then the government, you have nothing to say about who mounts it. Anybody can mount it and say anything they want. But if you're also a publisher, then like the Times, you can decide which letters to the editor to publish and which letters to the editor not to publish, and you take responsibility for that. So the government tries to get involved, and all of this is very new. I mean, you're talking about 20 or 30 years into this. It will take time for it to work itself out. But it's not a problem with free speech. It's a problem with a new format that nobody has ever played with before. And everybody is scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with it. And that happened with the printing press, as I said, and it'll take some time before it works out.
Let me ask 2 more questions before we open our questions to the audience. So folks, if you have questions, first of all, you can raise your hand either virtually or on camera, and we'll call on you, or you can put your questions in the chat and we'll be happy to take them and open your mics. And my first question is, where is the ACLU today? What are their main focuses right now?
How do I know?
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't been there for a few months short of 20 years. You know, they're doing a lot of things. They're not doing a lot of other things. I don't have any better idea than you. It's I have no connection institutionally or organizationally, and haven't for a very long time. So
You really cut that cord. That's very impressive.
well, you know, when you're, think of it this way: if you're the captain of an ocean liner for 30 years, and then you decide to retire, you get off the ocean liner, somebody else becomes the captain. And if they take the ocean liner in places where it shouldn't go, if they take the ocean liner too close to icebergs, or if they stop running the ocean liner altogether, and 20 years later, somebody comes to you and says, what do you think of how that ocean liner has been traveling? How would I know? So it's not that you cut the cord. It's that when you step off a position of leadership, other people take over, and you can't have it both ways. If I wanted to spend years playing with my grandchildren and doing personal things that I had postponed for decades, then that was my decision, and it had consequences. And one of the consequences was that I ain't in charge anymore, and I don't pay much more attention to the details than you do. I mean, I read the paper. I see things happening. Sometimes I see the ACLU comments on them. Sometimes they don't. I don't know why. Sometimes they say something that I don't like. No surprise. So, you know, I can have opinions about stuff, but I have no more connection with or ability to answer that question as to what the ACLU is doing these days than any other well-informed person.
And Nico, was the ACLU involved in the making of this film at all, or?
No. I emailed one of my contacts over there, let them know it was coming down the pike. They had their own documentary film that they were putting. So this is the 100th anniversary of the ACLU, I should say. The ACLU was founded in 1920. Its first annual report was called The Fight for Free Speech. I believe its second annual report was called A Year in the Fight for Free Speech. So, you know, free speech has kind of always been a part of the ACLU's DNA, but they put out this documentary called The Fight that doesn't really focus on free speech issues, but rather around their litigation surrounding the Trump administration. So they were mostly focused on that. I do hope that some of the current staff at the ACLU will check it out, and we're looking forward to sharing it with them. But no, this was an independent project, and it's, you know, it does obviously the ACLU is a part of the story because it was so much a part of Ira's life. But I feel as though the principles we're discussing, the values we're talking about, and the story we're telling isn't really necessarily about the ACLU, but about something much bigger than that organization.
And Nico, while we're close, I feel to a good pitching moment. Tell the audience where they could find out more about the film and where they should be sending their friends.
Yeah, well, until Friday, send your friends to the JCC, of course, which has the exclusive advanced screening. But then on Friday, it's opening up with Angelica Film Center in virtual cinema, and we'll be with them for a week. If it does well, maybe another week after that before going to the streaming platforms. It'll be on Amazon, Amazon Prime, iTunes, Google Play on October 23rd. And then it'll be on DVD and Blu-ray that following Tuesday, which I believe is October 27th. We had intended to do kind of a film festival circuit for the film, but that was before coronavirus. Coronavirus foiled a lot of our plans. The last little piece we had to put together for the film was the musical score, which was custom. And our composers, music supervisors, and musicians were all in LA, which was under lockdown. And so all the musicians actually had to record their parts independently, and the music supervisors had to piece it together in the edit. So if you enjoyed the score, know that there was a lot of work that went in on the back end to make that possible amidst a plague.
Wow. Well, I'm glad it's getting out at this time. I think the timing is right for it, and please, folks, do tell your friends and help share for these films. Independent films really need as much support from the community as possible. I was going to jump into one last question that I had, which is on another topic. As I was watching the film, I was thinking about a big topic. I grew up in Israel and was very impacted by Rabin's assassination. And today, a lot of the fingers get pointed at Netanyahu as being an inciter. And the government at that time, when Rabin was assassinated, they especially the left in Israel, puts a lot of power into this concept of incitement. There was even, I believe, a film that came out last year called Incitement that was all about that, and how the man who assassinated Rabin didn't act alone, but was influenced by the power of the free speech and the words that were around him. I would love to hear your take on this, Ira. I would love to start with you.
Well, people used to ask me about the vigorous protest of the anti-abortion crowd outside of abortion clinics. And it was pretty nasty. I mean, they would stand across the street and sometimes right next to women walking into the clinic and chant baby killer at them and all that kind of stuff. In many ways, I found that to be uglier and nastier and more cruel than any of the neo-Nazi stuff. But yeah, free speech allows them to do it. Then somebody gets a firebomb and throws it through the clinic's window, or takes a rifle and shoots one of the doctors. And people would say, you see what happens when you allow free speech? No, that's not what happens when you allow free speech. That's what happens when you allow violence. I mean, throwing a firebomb through the abortion clinic window is a form of expression, but it's not the kind of expression that the First Amendment protects. And to make the argument that because people are against abortion and speak out against abortion, they are somehow leading to the violence. It's the same kind of thing Trump is doing now with Black Lives Matter and with Antifa. People demonstrate peacefully, and then some lunatic does something violent, and the people who are demonstrating peacefully get hooked into that as if there was a cause and effect, which there is not. I mean, most of the violence that has happened during speech demonstrations has happened against the demonstrators. The Black Panthers used to march around in the 60s with rifles. They never shot anybody. They got shot. So, the whole idea that vigorous, passionate speech leads to violence or is responsible for the violence that other people commit, I just think that there's no evidence for that. It's a canard. I lived through a lot of assassinations when I was growing up. John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. The speech didn't cause that. Crazy people caused that. Unresolved problems helped cause that. But there's a line. I'm a pretty, aggressive, competitive guy. But there's a difference between looking somebody in the eye and telling them they're a son of a bitch and taking a gun and shooting them. And one does not lead to the other. It's just, and it's totally unfair, I think, to blame acts of violence on people who are speaking nonviolently, but vigorously. So, I think that's probably true in Israel as much as it's true here or anywhere else. I don't think human behavior changes very much. What the violence that happened in Nazi Germany in 1932 was not because of speech. It was because they were preventing speech. It was because thugs were being violent in the street and because Hitler encouraged that. When Donald Trump encourages the kind of violence that he has encouraged repeatedly to his own followers, that's what causes violence. The Black Lives Matter movement does not cause violence. And nobody has seen, there may be in any demonstration, somebody's going to break out and throw something through a window. That's always happened. That kind of violence happened during labor union strikes. It happened during, every movement has that because it attracts people who will do those kinds of things. But you can't put that on to the people who don't do it. And I don't think that there is a causal link there.
Nico, any final thoughts? Thank you, Ira. That was truly an important lesson that we all need to keep close to us.
Nothing that I think would add value to what Ira has already said. So I think I'm ready for audience questions if you don't have any more.
This is my last call on the audience who are being very shy tonight. I guess they're given the freedom of speech and they don't want to take advantage of it. Well,
you've got them all on mute.
That's how we handle the freedom of speech here.
One might say you're censoring them, Isaac.
It's a short leash. Even in person, we hold on to the microphone. We know our audience too well. Folks, any last questions before we sign off? Ira and Nico, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Our audience applauds. I think the film really says it all, and this conversation really enlightened us even further. Folks,
can I say also that this is the first time I've actually spoken to Ira, in this case digitally, or seen him outside of the film since our last recording when on our visit to Ebbets Field. And what was that, Ira, April 2019? I haven't seen Ira like this since then. We've spoken over the phone a few times, but this is a first for me in a long time. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you for making Zoom possible. Thank you, folks. Thank you for joining us, folks. Most important is, of course, please stay safe. We want to see you in person very soon, and go out and vote and help spread the word. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.